Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into something that, well, it feels pretty fundamental to how we think about health and diet sugar.
Right, specifically its connection to type 2 diabetes.
Exactly. And for a long time, the message has seemed pretty simple. Sugar's bad, cut down your total intake.
The idea often just boils down to sugar is sugar, no matter where it comes from.
But what if that picture is, well, far too simple? What if the source of the sugar matters, like, profoundly?
And what if some sources are way riskier than others?
And maybe even some might be protective, which sounds kind of crazy.
It does sound counterintuitive.
That's the finding at the heart of this massive new study we're looking at today, based on sources you shared with us. So our mission for this deep dive, really get into this surprising research, look at the specific data, linking different sugar sources to diabetes risk.
And try to figure out the metabolic story.
Mm-hmm.
Why is drinking your sugar maybe fundamentally different from eating it?
Get ready to challenge some assumptions. This is where it gets really interesting.
So the conventional view, like you said, it's really cast sugar as a major culprit in the global rise of type 2 diabetes, or T2D.
Yeah, the focus has been on cutting back, but maybe without enough nuance.
Often without much distinction based on the food it's actually in, just total grams.
And this new research seems to be saying that distinction is, well, absolutely critical.
It really does. The key finding from this very large new study is that the source of sugar makes a profound difference to T2D risk.
And the scale here is pretty impressive, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was conducted by researchers at BYU, Brigham Young University, and also institutions in Germany. They pulled together data from well over 500,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah, spanning multiple continents.
500,000 people. That's a serious amount of data to crunch.
It really is. The study's described as the most extensive analysis of its kind. Technically, it's a systematic review and dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies.
Okay, well, let's quickly break down that jargon just a bit. Systematic review and meta-analysis.
Right, so think of it like this. Systematic review means the researchers, they basically scoured all the existing high-quality studies on sugar intake and TTD they could possibly find.
Okay.
Then a meta-analysis means they took the actual data from those individual studies and combined it, pooled it into one massive data set for a new analysis.
To get a clearer signal.
Exactly, a more powerful signal.
Okay.
And dose response means they looked at how risk changes as the amount of sugar consumed goes up or down.
And prospective cohort studies.
Those are the ones that follow large groups of people over, many years. They track their diet, their lifestyle, and see who eventually develops a disease like T2D.
Got it. So combining all that data gives a much, much stronger picture than any single study could on its own.
Precisely.
And the headline from this massive picture, what's the big takeaway?
The headline discovery is quite stark, actually. Sugars from drinks, think soda, fruit juice, strongly linked to a significantly higher risk of developing TTD.
Okay, that part maybe isn't totally shocking these days.
True, but here's the kicker. Sugars from many other sources in the diet, not linked to higher risk.
Not linked.
And this is the truly surprising part. Some sources of sugar were even linked to potentially lower risk.
Lower risk. Okay, now you've got my full attention. But let's zoom in on those liquid sugars first, because that's where the strongest sort of negative signal seems to be.
Absolutely. And the findings for beverages were really consistent. They held up even after the researchers adjusted for other factors that could, confuse things.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like a person's BMI, their body mass index, their total calorie intake, other lifestyle risks,
Yeah.
smoking, exercise, things like that.
Okay, so they tried to isolate the effect of the sugary drinks themselves?
They did.
So starting with SSB's sugar-sweetened beverages. It's like soft drinks, energy drinks, sports drinks.
Exactly, all those. For SSBs, the finding was significant and quite specific. Each additional 12-ounce serving per day.
Like one can of soda.
Right, one standard can. Increase the risk for developing T2D by a relative 25%.
25% per daily serving.
Wow. And it wasn't just for people drinking, tons of it. The researchers found the increased risk started from the very first daily serving.
So no safe threshold. It's not like the first one is okay.
Apparently not. The risk begins to climb right away, according to this analysis.
Now, that 25% relative increase, that sounds huge. But let's just clarify relative risk again. It doesn't mean your absolute chance jumps by 25 percentage points, does it?
Correct. That's a really important distinction. It's a relative increase compared to whatever the baseline risk is. The study actually gives a helpful example.
Okay.
So let's say an average person's baseline risk of getting T2D over a certain time period is maybe 10%. Having just one 12-ounce soda a day could potentially raise that individual's risk to about 12.5%.
Okay, so a 2.5 percentage point increase in that case? Still significant.
Definitely. And if someone drank, say, 4 sodas a day, using that same logic, their risk might climb from that baseline 10% towards maybe 20%.
Potentially doubling their risk in that scenario.
Exactly. It's a substantial increase, even if it's not an absolute 25 points per drink.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Now, what about fruit juice? Because, it often gets a bit of a health halo. Vitamins, maybe 100% juice.
Yeah, that's a common perception. But even fruit juice showed a link here.
Yeah.
This included 100% fruit juice, nectars, juice drinks, the whole category.
And what was the number there?
Each additional 8-ounce serving per day. So a slightly smaller serving size than the soda increased the risk for developing T2D by a relative 5%.
5%. So less than soda, but still an increased risk from something often seen as healthier.
Exactly. The message isn't just avoid soda. It seems to be more like, be really careful about drinking your calories and sugar, period.
Even from fruit.
That seems to be the key takeaway for liquids. The researchers concluded that even 100% fruit juice, yeah, it has some nutrients, but it's ultimately a poor substitute for whole fruits.
Why is that?
Well, it goes back to its concentrated sugar content. And, crucially, the lack of fiber. Whole fruits have fiber, other components. They slow down sugar absorption, help regulate blood glucose.
Juice strips a lot of that away.
Often, yeah. You're left with this high-sugar liquid that, according to this massive study, is still harmfully associated with metabolic health.
This really lines up with what the lead author, Karen Delacorte, emphasized. She's quoted saying something like, this is the first study to draw clear dose-response relationships.
Yes, between different sugar sources and type 2 diabetes risk. And she pointedly adds that the study highlights why drinking your sugar is more problematic for health than eating it.
Okay, more problematic for health than eating it. That brings us right to the, frankly, head-turning part of this research.
The really surprising bit.
Yeah. If liquid sugars show this clear dose-response increase in risk, what on earth did they find about sugars from other sources? Solid foods.
This is where that conventional sugar is sugar wisdom gets, well, completely challenged. In striking contrast to the drinks, the study found something very different for sugars from solid food sources.
Okay, don't leave us hanging. What was the specific finding?
Okay, get this. The study found that consuming around 20 grams per day of total sucrose, that's basically table sugar,
Right.
and also total sugar, meaning the sum of all naturally occurring and added sugars in the diet,
Okay.
showed an inverse association with type 2 diabetes risk.
Wait, hang on. Did you just say inverse association?
Inverse, as in potentially protective.
Protective. Table sugar, potentially protective against type 2 diabetes? That sounds wrong. How significant was this effect?
That's exactly what the data hinted at, this surprising protective association. The study's results indicated that a 20-gram per day increase in either total sucrose or total sugar was associated with a statistically significant decrease in T2D risk compared to lower intakes.
Wow.
Now, it wasn't as large in magnitude as the increased risk we saw with the sugary drinks, let's be clear. But finding any kind of protective link for these broad categories of sugar, when they're consumed as part of a diet, in food, rather than dissolved in a drink, that's definitely counterintuitive. It's a core takeaway here.
That is fascinating. Okay, so why? What's the proposed reason for this dramatic metabolic difference? Why is drinking sugar seemingly so much riskier?
And how could eating it, maybe even including table sugar in foods, possibly be different or even protective in comparison?
Yeah.
Well, what's fascinating is the mechanism they propose. It seems to relate heavily to the form the sugar comes in.
The form, liquid versus solid.
Pretty much. Liquid sugar, like in drinks, it basically supplies isolated sugar molecules when you drink them, especially without much fiber or other nutrients alongside.
Like in soda or juice.
Exactly. They get absorbed very, very quickly. This leads to a rapid and much greater glycemic impact.
A faster, bigger spike in blood sugar.
Right. And this rapid influx, this flood of sugar, it can sort of overwhelm and disrupt normal liver metabolism.
Well, we're on the liver.
Yeah, potentially increasing liver fat accumulation, contributing to insulin resistance, which as we know, is a key precursor to type 2 diabetes.
So the liver just gets hit harder and faster by the sugar load from drinks.
That seems to be the idea. Now, contrast that with solid foods.
Okay.
When dietary sugars are consumed in foods, or maybe added to nutrient-dense solid foods, think like whole fruits, dairy products, maybe even baked goods or yogurt, where sugar is part of a more complex food structure.
Right, it's not just pure sugar water.
Exactly. The sugars aren't isolated. They're embedded within what scientists call the food matrix.
The food matrix. Okay, what's that?
Think of it as the overall structure of the food. It's the network of fiber, protein, fat, water, other components, everything that holds the food together.
Gotcha.
So when sugar is part of this matrix, it simply takes longer for your body to break down the food and absorb the sugar.
Ah, so it's a slower release.
Much slower. Because of the accompanying fiber, the fats, the proteins, other nutrients, these sugars tend to elicit a slower, gentler blood glucose response.
Less of a shock to the system.
Precisely. And that slower release is much less likely to cause that overwhelming metabolic stress on the liver that we see with a quick hit from liquids.
So it really boils down to the speed of the sugar hitting your system, and crucially what it's packaged with. The context matters.
Exactly. It's not just the sugar molecule itself, it seems. It's the context, the delivery system, the package it comes in.
This raises some huge questions for dietary advice, doesn't it? What are the implications here?
Yeah, big time. The lead author, Karen Delacorte, she underscored this. She said the study underscores the need for even more stringent recommendations for liquid sugars.
Like sodas and fruit juice.
Right, as they appear to harmfully associate with metabolic health. So double down on the warnings about drinking sugar.
But what about the implication for other sugars, especially given that that surprising potential protective finding for sugars and solids?
Well, this is a potential shift. Instead of just blanket recommendations to avoid all added sugars equally.
Which is kind of the message now, often.
It is. The suggestion here is that future dietary guidelines might consider the differential effects of sugar based on its source and form.
Wow. So moving beyond just added sugar is bad to thinking about how and where the sugar is added and what it's consumed with. That really matters metabolically.
That seems to be the implication, yeah, a significant potential shift in thinking.
Okay, just for everyone listening, for reference, the study is titled Dietary Sugar Intake and Incident Type 2 Diabetes Risk, a systematic review and dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies.
Quite a mouthful.
It is. And it was published in the journal Advances in Nutrition on March 21st, 2025. We'll put the full citation and the DOI link in the show notes for this deep dive.
Good idea. It's worth looking at the details if you're interested.
So when we bring this all back to you listening right now, what's the main takeaway?
Well, this research really challenges you to look beyond just, counting total sugar grams on a label.
It pushes you to think much more about the package the sugar comes in, the source.
Absolutely. It strongly reinforces decades of warnings about sugary drinks. Don't ignore those.
And it even adds fruit juice pretty clearly to that category with quantifiable dose-response risks for P2D.
Right. But then it offers this surprisingly different, maybe even cautiously optimistic, perspective on sugars found in solid foods.
Especially nutrient-rich ones.
Suggesting that the metabolic context, the food matrix, is absolutely key.
Yeah, it suggests the structure of the food, what the sugar is consumed alongside. That seems to matter immensely for metabolic health and diabetes risk.
Wow. That really was a deep dive that genuinely flipped some common thinking on its head.
Didn't it? The idea that drinking sugar, even from 100% juice, carries this clear dose-response risk for type 2 diabetes.
While sugar in solid foods might be metabolically different, maybe even potentially protective in some contexts compared to liquids. That's powerful. And complex.
It absolutely moves the conversation from just focusing on quantity, doesn't it?
Yes, towards quality, form, and context. Big time.
This deep dive, based on your sources, it certainly gives us a lot to chew on.
Intended.
Ha!
Maybe subconsciously. Okay, so here's one final provocative thought for you to consider based on all this.
If sugars found naturally in nutrient-dense solid foods, or even sugars added to them, if they really are metabolically different, maybe less risky than liquid sugars.
How does that change the way you think about, say, reaching for a piece of whole fruit versus pouring a glass of fruit juice?
Or maybe sugar added to a high-protein yogurt versus grabbing a sugary soda.
Yeah. What other sources of sugar in your own diet might fit into that solid, potentially less risky because of the food matrix category? Something to mull over.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some valuable insights and maybe even an aha moment or two.